Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
Well, we're going to take up Zechariah chapter 9 this evening. Scholars have generally divided the book of Zechariah into two sections, the two sections being chapters 1 through 8, which we completed last week, and the balance of the book beginning with this chapter 9. If we were to give a title to this second half of the book, we would probably put it in two different divisions. The first part we would call the recovery of the promised land. The recovery of the promised land. And then the next part we would probably title the triumphant intervention of the Lord. I want us to note, though, that a lot points to Messiah Yeshua within what we're going to be looking at this evening, both first coming and second coming. Now, this chapter 9 is basically an introduction into what comes for the rest of the book. So let's jump right in. These first two verses are going to give us geographic boundaries of the promised land as it was originally laid out in God's promise, which has never been realized until this day. Not even up until this day, actually. All through all of the history of Israel, Israel has never controlled all of that land that God said, this will be your land. This is what I promised you. So let's start with Zechariah chapter 9, verse 1. It reads, a prophecy, the word of Adonai, in the land of Hadrach and Damascus is where God comes to rest. That's important. This is telling us where he's actually going to come back. And it says, in the land of Hadrach and Damascus is where God comes to rest. For the eyes of humankind are directed towards Adonai, as are those of all the tribes of Israel. When the Israelites invaded the land that God had promised them, when they crossed the Jordan River with Joshua, they weren't able to claim possession of all of the promised land, and neither were any of their later kings, even the greatest, not even David or Solomon. This prophecy then is a picture of finally occupying all of the promised land, the land promised to Israel, that they've never been able to keep under or get under their control until this prophetic time coming. The general movement in this prophecy is from north to south. We're going to begin to scan this promised land moving from north to south. The word translated into prophecy here actually literally means something uplifted. Something uplifted. This is the promised land. This is something that is really uplifted, if you will. This is talking about at the very beginning of the land of Hadrach. Hadrach. This is the northernmost place listed. The land of Hadrach is listed nowhere else in the Bible, only in this one particular place. The location of Hadrach is only known to us from Assyrian inscriptions. It's north of Hamat. Hamat is about 115 miles north of Damascus, the modern city. And the modern city in the approximate location of ancient Hamat is called Haman today. And this Hadrach is located north of that in an area that borders the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River was the northern boundary of the nation Israel, or is to be the northern boundary of the nation Israel, as it was given to them by God, but occupation never historically received. I'm harping on that just so that we go away with that point ripe in our minds. Now the verse ends with the statement that not only will the eyes of Israel be directed towards Adonai, but the eyes of all humankind, because this is going to be a big event when it takes place. Now many have read this and conjectured that this word eyes should be translated cities, indicating that those cities that lie within the limits of the territory promised to God's people would be directed towards God. I have to tell you that is a real stretch, but I wanted to make you aware of that because you might see this in some of the materials that come floating by us in today's information age, which is what Yeshua warned us about. Be careful what you see and read and what you pay attention to, because there's going to be a lot of false stuff brought in at the end of the age. But there's something interesting about this in Revelation 1:7, please. It says, "Look, he is coming with the clouds." He would be the returning Messiah. "Look, he is coming with the clouds. Every eye will see him, including those who pierced him. And all the tribes of the land will mourn him." Yes, amen. This is going to take place. In other translations, it may read, "Other tribes of the north will mourn." The application of what is being said in Revelation 1:17, really, which comes from two sources within our study focus, is probably relevant here to Zechariah 9:1. Every eye will see him. Every eye will see him. It certainly describes what's being said in that verse. Now, moving on to Zechariah 9:2, please. "Also Hamat at its border, Zor and Zion for the wise." So just up there, we're going to look back for just a second. That we've been talking about the land of Hadrach and Damascus, also Hamat at its border, Zor and Zion, or Zor and Sidon. I want to bring up for you, because this is speaking of the land, the dimensions of the land of Israel at Yeshua's return. I want to bring up a map, please. And I want us to look at this map, basically, that this is Hamat that was mentioned in there. This is Zor, and this is Sidon. These are in what was, or what is currently today, Lebanon. This is in central, if you will, Syria. This is Damascus, right in here where Damascus is, and the mountain that everybody is contending with, Mount Hermon, is right in here between, just above where it says Geshur. And Mount Hermon isn't a nice round mountain like everybody wants to picture. It's a very long stretch of mountain, and Israel controls only the bottom or southeastern edge of that mountain. Here Hamat is mentioned by name. It's located, as we mentioned it earlier, in the north-central portion of modern-day Syria. Jews have not always laid claim to this region, but I want you to look at this dotted line that's around here. This is during the reign of Solomon, and Solomon, while he didn't directly control this land to the north of the Sea of Galilee, the tribe of Dan would have been here, and that's about as far as they actually controlled. If you notice all of these states in here, Geshur, Aram, Son, whatever that says. Those are countries that had pledged allegiance to Solomon to keep him from coming and whacking them and taking over their countries directly. Israel never conquered north of Dan, as I just mentioned, which is just to the southwest of Mount Hermon, and we marked that in there. And although during Solomon's reign, some of this up to the Euphrates came under Israel, and we marked out the vassal states and everywhere. Biblically, the northern end of Israel's territory is clearly at the northern end of the valley of Lebanon, and that leads us up to the Euphrates River. It'll also include Lebanon out to the coast for quite a ways up. And you can find this more on this information if you want to in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 7. There's some things given very specifically. It's also interesting that Ezekiel 48:1 indicates that the land of Israel at its northernmost boundary will extend near Hamath again. So we have two sources within Scripture that, other than what we're looking at right now, that extend the northern boundaries of Israel into that region. Now, in the times of David and Solomon, this territory along the coast here was controlled by the Phoenicians. It says Phoenicia right in here, Sidon and Zoar. Right now, again, that area is in modern Lebanon. Sidon was the northernmost of the Phoenician cities at the time of David and Solomon. Zechariah 9:3, please. Keep that map in mind as we refer to some of these. Zoar, off the coast of Lebanon, built herself a fortified tower, heaping up silver as it were dust and fine gold as if it were mud in the streets. That meant that they gained riches. But Zoar built herself a fortified tower. And that's a fascinating thing. It was a constant problem for them to defend it as they were originally located on the mainland. So eventually the people of Tyre took possession of a group of islands just offshore, about a half a mile offshore. And there they built their stronghold, an island fortress, and I believe that's what's being referred to here as their fortified tower. The rampart that they built around that island to protect that island was 27 feet thick and 2,500 feet long. It's to wrap it around that whole island. Phoenicians were skilled builders and seamen, and they had technological and commercial superiority. That's described in Ezekiel 37, if you'd like to read about it, that resulted in all this wealth and power, the silver as it were dust and the gold as if it were mud on the streets. The defenses of Tyre were so substantial that the Assyrians besieged it for 5 years without success. That's this fortification they built around this island out there. When the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar came along, they besieged it for 13 years, again without success. It wasn't until Alexander the Great came along, 150 years later, that he was able to conquer Tyre, and he did it in about 7 months. About 7 months, which gives us a little insight into Alexander's military genius. Reason he was able to overrun the amount of territory that he did in such a short period of time, he had a small army, small, fast-moving army, probably about 50,000 men at most. When he went into an area, he would have no one covering his backside. So in order to make himself safe, he left nothing. In whatever he went through, he destroyed completely so that nothing could attack him from the back as he moved on to his next conquest. He did this to Tyre. How he did this is he destroyed the mainland city, took the debris that was left over from the mainland city, and he built a causeway out to the island that his army could march on. and he overran it. Just as simple as that. To the prophet Ezekiel, Tyre represented the pride by which man claims responsibility for his own achievements without dependence on God. There's a picture built into us with Tyre about that. Zechariah 9:4, please. But Adonai will dispossess her, speaking of Tyre, break her power at sea, while the city itself will be destroyed by fire. At the time Zechariah was written, Tyre was very prosperous, as we've just looked at. Here it is prophesied that this prosperity is going to come to an end. Well, Tyre was a symbol of how man claimed responsibilities for his own achievements without any dependence on God. How many of you remember that Frank Sinatra hit, I Did It My Way? Exactly the spirit that Tyre represents. I did it my way. Some things never change. We still have this in the modern age. I did it my way. Sinatra may have some explaining to do about the music that he presented. Now the words Adonai will dispossess her here implies that Tyre's wealth was a gift from God. Because of this human pride, Tyre was destroyed. Again, it's a picture for us of the pride of man getting in the way of God and God bringing correction. In a symbolic way, it's representing what is going to happen to all human pride. Alexander the Great destroyed the city so completely that it was never ever rebuilt again. At that time he killed 10,000 people in the city. He exiled or sold into slavery, really. Sold into slavery another 30,000, probably to raise funds for his military campaign. Conquest, after all, was to be a profitable enterprise. Ezekiel 26:4 is prophetic of this being Ezekiel 26:4 is prophetic of this that was fulfilled by Alexander. Today, Tyre is a minor town called Sur, C-S-U-R, with only about 6,000 inhabitants in Lebanon. Zechariah 9:5 and 6. On seeing this, Ashkelon will be terrified. Gaza too will writhe in pain. See, Ashkelon and Gaza were in existence at that time. And they saw, as they see this happening and Alexander's moving down the coast, they were terrified. Gaza too will writhe in pain. Likewise, Ekron, as her hopes are dashed. The king will vanish from Gaza. Ashkelon will be without people. And a mixed people will live in Ashdod as I destroy the pride of the Philistines. The pride of the Philistines. We're moving our way down the coast from modern Lebanon. First city mentioned here is Ashkelon. There's still the city of Ashkelon today in Israel along the coast, about 30 miles south of Jaffa, Tel Aviv. It says says here that the inhabitants of Ashkelon will be terrified. They will see in fear what's going on, and this refers to the devastation carried out in Phoenicia up to the north. See, everything is moving from north to south in what God's describing here for us. They anticipate the same fate coming to themselves, and they had good reason to, because the same fate did happen to him. The next city south, as we move south, is Gaza. Today's Gaza, in those times called Gaza. We hear about Gaza almost every day in the news right now. Fire kites and balloons almost every day. Over the last 100 days, one drifted as far away as Beersheba, which is halfway across the Negev of Israel, just this past week. Gaza's location makes it an important place as a provisioning point. It's an important city. It was an important city long before the Philistines appeared on the scene. Gaza will be affected even more as it will writhe in pain. Some translations say be in great anguish. Next city mentioned is Ekron. This is in the northernmost part of the 5 cities of the Philistines. It's mentioned in Joshua 13:3, for those of you who want to look things up, Joshua 13:3. It's about 9 miles east of the Mediterranean Sea, just a little north of Ashdod. Now I want to put another map up. Both of these maps that we're looking at this evening, by the way, are in the back of the Complete Jewish Bible. So you can use them if you want to review what we've gone through here in the lesson. This is looking to the south. Here is Sidon. Here's Zor. All right. Here is Jaffa. And here is Gaza. Here. As we work our way back up, here's Ashkelon and Ashdod. We've moved our way south now, down this coast. Ekron no longer exists. He was talking about Ekron being done in. It no longer exists. Its exact location is actually in question. Let's go back to Zechariah 9:5 and 7, please. On seeing this, Ashkelon will be terrified, seeing what's happened all the way up the coast in Zor and Sidon. On seeing this, Ashkelon will be terrified. Azza too will writhe in pain, likewise Ekron, as her hopes are dashed. The king will vanish from Azza. Ashkelon will be without people, and a mixed people will live in Ashdod as I destroy the pride of the Philistines. I will end their eating meat with its blood still in it, snatching the disgusting things from between their teeth. But the surviving remnant will belong to our God. It will be like a clan of Judah, and Ekron will be like a Uvasai. Uvasai. The king will vanish from Gaza. Gaza is going to lose its independence. Remember, what we're looking at here is something that we can transfer forward to just before Messiah returns. The king will vanish from Gaza. The city will lose its independence and be incorporated into a larger political whole. Ultimately, become part of Yeshua's Israel. Ancient Ascalon is prophetic. Ancient Ascalon will suffer an even worse fate. It will no longer be inhabited. Modern Ashkelon, which is a thriving city in Israel today, getting some of the balloon fires floating into it. Modern Ashkelon, which is a thriving city in Israel today, is not the same location as old Ashkelon. The original Ashkelon was directly on the sea coast, and its ruins are still visible. It's still uninhabited. Verse 6, Ashdod, which is inhabited today, will have its native inhabitants replaced by a mixed bag of people. The word here for mixed peoples could even mean bastards. The Hebrew is mamzer, which is used many times in speaking of a child born to a union that would never be called a valid marriage. It could mean children of people who had never had a valid relationship with Yeshua. False gods instead. But the children ultimately end up turning to Yeshua. We could end up with a mixed people living in Ashdod. Mamzers. What's interesting here is after we get past verse 2, what we've been going through is parallel to the conquest of Alexander the Great. Some commentaries will tell you that's all that this is talking about, but I think Alexander was simply a type and foreshadow of lands that were going to be conquered. In the middle of verse 6, and this is important, in the middle of verse 6 there's a grammatical change from the third person to the first person. Prior to this change, in verse 6 up there, a mixed people will live in Ashdod, and then bang, there's a change, as I destroy the pride. See that? Go from third person to first person. Prior to this change, what man would be doing is related. After this change, Adonai is explaining what he's going to be doing. As I destroy the pride of the Philistines, a pride that can be best described as following the wants and the desires of their own hearts without any reference to the will of God. Verse 7 indicates that these mixed people will be transformed by Adonai. Read Yeshua. These people will be transformed by Yeshua, and Adonai explains what he will do. First of all, I will end their eating meat with blood still in it. We're not to eat meat with blood still in it. This is an instruction in Torah. Deuteronomy 12:16 and 12:23 speak of this. It's also spoken of in Acts 15, verse 20. This was a pagan Gentile custom at this time to eat meat with blood still in it. Frankly, it still is today. Number 2, snatching the disgusting things from between their teeth is referring to things forbidden by Mosaic law. This would, if we go back to those people in the ancient times, this would include dogs, swine, mice, because these were sometimes things sacrificed to the Philistine false gods, and then after they were sacrificed to the false gods, were eaten by the Philistines in their festivals. The abandonment of these non-kosher practices are a condition of these people's continued presence in the land. But a surviving remnant will belong to our God, and it will be like a clan in Judah, and Ekron will be like the Yevishui. Now, Adonai is saying he's going to bring about wholesale change in the way that the Gentiles are conducting themselves in the land today. The Gentiles in the land conducting themselves in the land today basically are worshiping a false god, because basically all the Gentiles in the land today that aren't Christian are worshiping Islam. There's also Buddhists and you name other false religions, but he's going to square this all away when he comes into place. Now, the abandonment of these non-kosher practices are a condition of these people's continued presence in the land, along with abandoning completely worship of false gods. When these practices are ended, this remnant will belong to God, a clan that is spiritually incorporated into Judah, the current area basically south of Jerusalem. These will be enrolled, this remnant will be enrolled among the chosen people. This has not happened yet. Back when we went from the third person to the first person, we started talking about prophecy. I think this is still going to occur. Finally, Ekron is compared with the Jebusites, which is given here as a Yuvasai. It reflects the fact that when David took Jerusalem, he didn't wipe out all of the inhabitants, which he could have, but chose not to. When Messiah returns and takes over the land, he's not going to wipe out all the inhabitants, which he could. But he's going to keep those that will come around to being part of worshiping the God of Israel with himself as Messiah. He will spare the remnant and allow them to be absorbed into Judah. Zechariah 9:8, please. Then, after this happens, then God is saying, I will guard my house against armies, so that none will march through or return. No oppressor will ever again overrun them, for now I am watching with my own eyes. See, when Messiah comes back and takes over, that's going to be the end of any foreign power ever being able to come in and do anything about replacing or displacing Israel. God's saying that from then on he will guard his house personally, not only probably referring to his temple, but Israel in general. All of that area that he laid out in the original land grant that runs basically from the river Euphrates to the river of Egypt. No longer will any alien armies march through Judah's territory, because God himself will guard and prevent such from happening. The Hebrew clause actually says none will march through and return. If we remember from way back in Daniel 11, where the false Messiah comes from the north, goes through the land of Israel to the south, and then he returns and sets up housekeeping in the temple. That's what this is referencing back to, or referencing to. Nothing like this is ever going to happen again. What is said here placing this at the start of the 1,000-year reign of Messiah, when the cloud filled with fire forms a chuppah over Zion. Also, the eyes of God connotes the all-seeing eye of God, proposing to provide for and defend his people. Here in the beginning of the second part of Zechariah, two important facts are established. Number one, God's victory is a certainty. And number two, the Lord intends to bring back to himself his people Israel that have been alienated from him. These two facts underline all that follows in the rest of the chapters of Zechariah and culminate in the universal worship of the King, Adonai Tsevaot, who will be there in the form of Messiah Yeshua. Zechariah 9 and 10, please. Rejoice with all your heart, daughter of Zion. Shout out loud, daughter of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. Now, see if you remember where you've seen this before. He is righteous and he's victorious, yet he is humble. He is riding on a donkey. Yes, on a lowly donkey's colt. I will banish chariots from Ephraim, that's Israel, and war horses from Jerusalem, that's Judah. The warrior's bow will be banished, and he will proclaim peace to the nations. He will rule from sea to sea, and from the Euphrates River to the ends of the earth. I want to stop for a second and look at that last line, that last sentence. He will rule from sea to sea, from the Euphrates River to the ends of the earth. We started with the Euphrates River as the northern boundary of the land that he promised that he would give to Israel and the Messiah would come back and occupy. But never in any of this does he ever give us the rest of the dimensions below what's modern Israel and over to the Nile. He basically says, this is where Messiah is going to come and rule from, and out of the bottom of that, that's going to sweep out, and he's going to rule the whole world. Do we see that? He will rule from sea to sea, from the Euphrates River to the ends of the world. Begins with an instruction to rejoice with all your heart. Rejoice with all your heart. This is a call to unrestrained expression of joy. This is directed to the daughter of Zion and the daughter of Jerusalem. Since the names of the towns in the Hebrew are all in the feminine, the word daughter is appropriate here. These expressions are found frequently in Lamentations and Isaiah. They also appear in the Psalms, Jeremiah, Micah, Zephaniah. The purpose is to draw attention to the personal relationship between God and his people, especially on a national level. Israel and all of the towns in it are his daughters. That's how close his relationship is at the national level. Once this relationship is noted here in these verses, the focus then switches to the king himself. This coming king is announced with his character and his mission being described. First, he's described as righteous. He's described as righteous. The word in the Hebrew for righteous is Zadok. Zadok. Remember Malach Zadok, who somehow gets to be Melchizedek in the Christian Bibles? King of righteousness, Malach Zadok, the righteous king, Prince of Peace, who brought out bread and wine, Malach Zadok, who was the Cohen, the priest, the high priest of El Elyon, God above. I'll give you three guesses who it was that Abram encountered in Genesis 14:18 through 20. His meeting with Melchizedek, King of Righteousness, was a meeting with pre-incarnate Yeshua. In Zechariah, this righteous character encompasses the activity of the king in governing, in administrative justice, in encouraging right among the people. The second adjective in verse 9, Mosah, is translated victorious here, is rooted in the Hebrew word Messiah, out of which we get Messiah. It means saved or delivered. The NIV translates the word here as being salvation. It's an interesting word, this Hebrew word Mosa. It's an interesting word in the Nephal. Nephal really means must do. There's something that must be done, had to be done to get us to this point. It's reflexive in the Hebrew. So take this to mean that the coming king has had to have been through some form of an ordeal. Now remember, we're not reading the Gospels. We're reading prophecy way, way before the events that the Gospels are talking about. We need to take this to mean that the coming king has been through some ordeal in which he experienced God's deliverance. And I believe this points directly at Yeshua's first coming, when he's been on the execution stake and yet rose from the grave and went to be in the presence of God. So the thought of him being victorious is not in himself, but in the might of the God of Israel. His triumph, therefore, is the triumph of the faith of the servant of God, which can transfer to each of us if we are true, faithful servants of God. He is a picture that came before us. Remember, Yeshua was 100% man as well as being 100% God. The Hebrew indicates here that the thought of his being victorious is not in himself, but in the might of the God of Israel. And again, he was a human being that was infilled with God. And therefore, his triumph is a triumph of faith of the servant of God. Let's support that by going to Hebrews, Messianic Jews, chapter 5, verses 5 through 10. So neither did Messiah glorify himself to become Kohen Gadol. Rather, it was the one who said to him, "You are my son. Today I've become your father." Verse 6, also he says in another place, "You are a Kohen, a priest, forever to be compared with Melchizedek, the king of righteousness." During Yeshua's life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions, crying aloud and shedding tears to the one who had the power to deliver him from death, and he was heard because of his godliness. We can all go through this same thing. Even though he was the son, he learned obedience through his sufferings. And after he had been brought to the goal, he became the source of eternal deliverance to all who obey him. Since he had been proclaimed by God as Kohen Gadol to be compared with Melchizedek, king of righteousness. Now this is all laid out for us hundreds of years before we ever get to the time Yeshua comes in his first ministry. This is all laid out in the Hebrew so that we could understand it. Remember when Messiah taught and he would use scriptures as his points of reference? He was going to stuff like this throughout the Old Testament. See how what we've just read expands our understanding of this concept of being victorious found here in Zechariah 9. The coming King Messiah will be righteous and victorious because he was made perfect. He was made perfect because of what he had to go through. With this in mind, we read that the king is humble. The Hebrew here is ani. A word often used in the sense of poor or afflicted, brings to mind ideas of Isaiah 53, which is the fourth of three servant songs, and we just can't get into that this evening. Let's go back to Zechariah 9, 9, and 10. I'll read through this again to cover what we've just been looking at. Rejoice with all your heart, daughter of Zion. Shout out loud, daughter of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous, he is victorious, yet he is humble. He is riding on a donkey, yes, on a lowly donkey's colt. I will banish chariots from Ephraim and war horses from Jerusalem. The warrior's bow will be banished, and he will proclaim peace to the nations. He will rule from sea to sea, from the Euphrates River to the ends of the earth. See, verse 9 talks about the first coming. Verse 10 talks about the second coming. Verse 9 is talking about the first coming, which qualified him to return as the king and banish all the chariots and everything and rule and proclaim peace to the nations as he ruled the world. Riding on a donkey. Yes, riding on a lowly donkey as he comes into Jerusalem. The king does not ride on a horse, which would suggest conquest on his part at that time, but on a donkey's colt. This mount was perfect for someone who comes on a mission of peace. In the stone edition of Tanakh, something that is written in non-believing Israel for non-believing Israelites to be reading and studying, in the comments it says, Messiah will be an humble man riding on a donkey. That one's not going to be hard to prove at some point. It says that Messiah will be a humble man riding on a donkey rather than an ostentatious horse. That's a comment from Rashi, who is a non-believer. In verse 10, we're still in the first person. God is taking the initiative here. Following words in this verse deal with complete disarmament. The mention of Ephraim and Jerusalem is an indication of the northern and southern kingdoms being reunited at this time. This is something that's been going on since the new nation of Israel was founded in 1948. When this prophecy was written, the northern kingdom no longer existed, had gone into diaspora. There will be a total disarmament of the world. All of the nations will benefit from this peace, and it will be ensured by a righteous king who will rule over the whole earth. Again, this is pointing to Messiah Yeshua. What seems to be meant here is the king will act as an arbitrator among the nations of the earth, and his justice will make implements of war unnecessary and outlawed. We'll see in Revelation that Messiah will rule the earth with a rod of iron. Yeah, he'll be the arbitrator among the nations, but he'll rule the earth with an iron rod. His arbitration will be, this is how you're going to conduct yourselves. The extent of this rule is defined as being from sea to sea, from the river Euphrates to the ends of the earth. First, the kingdom that he rules will be Israel, and in its complete dimensions, Israel, as it is laid out to be by God from the beginning. And from there, he will govern and receive homage from the nations of the earth. Very much what we covered in chapter 7 as we studied that. Zechariah 9, 11, and 12, please. Also you, by the blood of your covenant, I release your prisoners from the dungeon, the cistern that has no water in it. Return to the stronghold, you prisoners with hope. This day I declare to you that I will grant you double reparation. It's going to be twice as good as it was before. I will grant you double reparation. Verse 11 begins with the particle also, which is the means to closely connect the new theme of this verse with what we've just been looking at prior to getting here. So now God enlarges on that new era that's been being described to us in what we've just looked at. It gets into enlarging on how it affects people of his covenant. This, by the blood of your covenant, is a literal translation. Also you, by the blood of your covenant. It's a literal translation. Only in Exodus 24, 7 and 8 is the blood of the covenant used in Tanakh other than in this passage. Only here and in Exodus 24, 7 and 8, I really want to impress on us that this is the only other place other than 9/11. So let's look at Exodus 24, 7, 8. Then he took the book of the covenant, this is Moses, and read it aloud so that the people could hear, and they responded, everything that Adonai has spoken we will do and obey. Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, "This is the blood of the covenant which Adonai has made with you in accordance with all these words." I'm really, again, want to impress on us, this is the only place in the Old Testament other than Zechariah 9:11 that the blood of the covenant is spoken of. And note the association of these as they apply to the position of Yeshua in the Seder. The position here, Exodus 24 and Zechariah 9. Take a note of these as they apply to the position of Yeshua at the Seder. What was he saying at the Seder? What he was saying at the Seder was that the covenant with Israel had been broken, the covenant where the blood was sprinkled on them, and they were banished from the land. They were banished from the land over breaking this covenant. In the last chapter, chapter 8, we referred to the new covenant, Jeremiah 31:30, and Yeshua said to them at the Seder, which was in Mark 14:14, that when he held up the cup, what it represented is, "This is my blood which ratifies the new covenant." See, the old covenant was ratified by the bloodshed of a sacrifice. And this is my blood which ratifies the new covenant, my blood shed on behalf of many people. I think we must assume that this blood of your covenant here in Zechariah 9:11, must refer to the blood Yeshua shed for many people that he referred to in the Seder. Back to 9:11-12, please. "Also you, by the blood of your covenant, I release your prisoners from the dungeon, the cistern that has no water." That's hell. "Return to the stronghold, you prisoners, with hope. This day I declare to you that I will grant you double reparation." It goes on to say here, "I release your prisoners." The Hebrew here has a perfect tense indicating a past action. Yeshua's first coming was when this took place. It's now a past action that will continue beyond the return of the exiles into the land. And finally, the expression "from the dungeon, the cistern that holds no water," this is to be delivered from the pit, which is to be delivered from life to death. Also, Yeshua says in John 5:24, quote, "Yes, indeed, I tell you that whoever hears what I am saying and trusts in the one who sent me has eternal life." So encompassed in this Zechariah 9:11 is the new covenant, all the requirements of it as stated by Yeshua. Verse 12 then is a little difficult. It says, "Return to the stronghold, you prisoners, with hope. This day I declare to you that I will grant you double reparation." The word stronghold here and return to the stronghold only occurs here. In all of Scripture, this only occurs here. But a form of that word, stronghold, is used in Isaiah 22:10, where it is used to describe the fortifying walls of Jerusalem to make it inaccessible to enemies. The translators in the Stone Edition Tanakh take this same word used here in Zechariah to mean Jerusalem. The thought here might even be of the Jerusalem to be garrisoned by the presence of God, the righteous King Messiah. The invitation here for those looking for the final age, the Messianic age, to experience his fulfillment, and the promise is to grant you double reparation, is similar to the promise of God in Isaiah 40, verse 2, where he says, "Tell Jerusalem, take heart. Proclaim to her that she has completed her time of service, that her guilt has been paid off, that she has received at the hand of Adonai double, as in reparation for all her sins." And the reparation here in Zechariah 9:2 promises great increase. Double an abundance of everything that produces genuine spiritual prosperity. In a lot of ways, this is actually paralleling the thoughts of chapter 8. Zechariah 9:13, please. For I have bent Judah as my bow and made Ephraim its arrow. Judah is the southern kingdom, Ephraim is the northern kingdom. I will rouse your sons, Zion, and make you like a warrior's sword against your sons, Greece. This pictures God's judgment in a very particular way. The long-separated tribes of the northern and southern kingdoms are united at this time, but they're not only united, but will unite as a single weapon in the hands of God. For I've bent Judah as my bow and made Ephraim as its arrow. I will rouse your son, Zion, and make you like a warrior's sword. Judah is God's bow, Ephraim is God's arrow. I will rouse your son, Zion, is a direct address by God to Zion, where God states he will make them, the tribes of Israel, like a warrior's sword. Literally like the sword of a mighty man in his hand against your sons, Greece. Most translations give the Hebrew word Yevah here as Greece. Oftentimes this Hebrew word is thought of as referring to distant unknown peoples at the edge of civilization, and generally indicates worldwide victory for God through his people. I believe here it's talking about those who are seeking to move away from him, those that as he brings these things into effect will still curse his name. Zechariah 9:14 and 15. Adonai will appear over them, and his arrow will flash like lightning. Adonai Elohim will blow the shofar and go out in the whirlwinds of the south. Adonai Tzavaot will defend them. They will devour and trample the sling stones. Hang on to that passage. That passage is fantastic. Adonai Tzavaot will defend them. This is the northern and the southern kingdom come together to be the sword in the hand of Adonai. They will devour and trample the sling stones. They will drink and roar as if they had drunk wine. Won't be like they drunk wine, but it will be as if they had. They will be filled like basins and like the corners of the altar. That's a load. Adonai will appear over them. This refers to the second coming of Messiah, coming on the cloud. Note the words in Matthew 24:31, spoken by Yeshua himself. Then the Son of Man will appear in the sky. All the tribes of the land will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. He will send out his angels with a great shofar, and they will gather his chosen people from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. What is the sign of the Son of Man? The cloud coming in the sky. This sounds like Isaiah 4:4-6 that we looked into last week. The cloud filled with fire that forms a chuppah over the Zion. That's what we were looking at last week in Isaiah 4:4-6. The cloud that forms a shadow that is a sukkah that we will live under or live in just temporarily, only 1,000 years. Think of the cloud of Exodus 19 where the cloud comes down on the mountain. Thunder and lightning in that cloud and a long shofar blast that called his people to him. In the midst of this will appear Adonai physically in the form of Yeshua. That's when the second heavenly shofar goes off. Over them, Adonai Zavaot will be their defense in the form of Yeshua. His arrow will flash like lightning. Symbolically, this is showing that God will rout his enemies, the enemies of people. Adonai Elohim will blow the shofar. Very interesting that it says Adonai Elohim himself will blow the shofar. Adonai Elohim is speaking to all of this plurality of God being involved in this. The only other place I'm aware where it speaks of Adonai, of God himself blowing the shofar, is in 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17, please. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a rousing cry, with a call from one of the ruling angels, and with God's shofar, and those who died united with Messiah will be the first to rise. Then we who are left still alive will be caught up with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we will always be with the Lord. I'm going to give you a little bit of a rabbi trail here. That word air in verse 17, to meet the Lord in the air, certainly has its root in the original language in ruach. Why then not translate this as being caught up in the Spirit? And thus we will always be with the Lord. Back to Zechariah 9:14, please. Adonai will appear over them. His arrow will flash like lightning. Adonai Elohim will blow the shofar and go out in the whirlwinds of the south. Remember, we're moving from north to south. Adonai Tsevaot will defend them. They will devour and trample the sling stones. They will drink and roar as if they had drunk wine. They will be filled like basins and like the corners of the altar. Go out with the whirlwinds of the south. The thought goes back to Horeb, the mountain of God, where Adonai met with his people, Exodus 19:16. This tells of a shofar blast so loud that it made the people tremble. Well, talk about loud. This shofar blast coming will make people rise from the dead. And he will go out and gather his people from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Verse 15 begins with the thought that Adonai Tsevaot will not only frighten the enemy, shofar blasts, but protect and defend his people. His people will trample and devour the sling stones. What might the sling stones be today in our day and age? A sling stone is something that is fired from a launcher. What's fired from a launcher today? Missiles. Missiles. That's an interesting phrase because it says the missiles that the enemy's been sending will be made useless. There will be no more incoming from the enemy to harm Israel, to harm us. We would think that the enemy might be squashed, physically destroyed, but it's not. It's what the enemy is sending at us that's destroyed. See, the enemy is made weaponless, helpless, and they have two choices. Either turn to the Lord of Israel, who has proven himself the superior God, or go to the pit. This is spiritual warfare. What better way to destroy the enemy than to just shut him off? His implements of war are made useless. He'll stand there helpless before those who his goal had been to destroy. And again, understanding at that point whose God is superior. The result of this is going to be a victory banquet. That victory banquet's talked about in Matthew's Gospel. It's going to be one of the great exuberance among the people. Joy so great as if it knew no limit. It will be as if they had drunk wine. Acts chapter 2 comes to mind in this, doesn't it? In the celebration that's going to be going on. The reference to the basins and the corners of the altar refers to the bowls of sacrificial blood that were poured out in the corners of the altar into those bowls. We will be filled like that basin, like those basins. We will be like the altar covered by his blood when the enemy is destroyed. This, I think, is reflected to us in Psalm 27, 5 and 6, please. For he will conceal me in his shelter. On the day of trouble, he will hide me in the folds of his tent. He will set me high on a rock. Then my head will be lifted up above my surrounding foes, and I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing praises to Adonai. This will be us in the shelter, in the shadow of his shelter. Zechariah 9:16, please. On that day Adonai, their God, will save them as the flock of his people, for they will be like gems in a crown sparkling over his countryside. What wealth is theirs, what beauty! Grain will make the young men thrive, and the new wine the young women. Here God's people, those who have their salvation, are described for us in two ways. One, the flock of his people. The flock of his people. In Ezekiel chapter 34, 11 through 16, it's described this way. That's something you can look up and read if you'd like. Take time to read that, please. Ezekiel 34, 11 through 16. It's described this way. There will come a time when those that shepherd the flock are replaced, and Adonai Elohim will take their place. I'm going to go away. Adonai is going to take my place. Actually, I hope to be riding the white horse just to his right, one step back. Take time to read that Ezekiel 34, 11, 16 again. Second thing is that the people of Israel, the remnant, this remnant that has come aboard, this third of Israel that he brings through the fire, will be like gems in a crown sparkling over his countryside. That echoes of what's prophesied in Isaiah 54, 10 through 14. The land will have an equal wealth and prosperity and will have permanent peace. Young men and young women together with wheat and new wine are symbolic of the prosperity of the land during that era. I want to take us to Amos 9, 11 through 15, please. When that day comes, I will raise up the fallen sukkah of David. A sukkah is a temporary dwelling. The 1,000-year reign of Messiah is a temporary dwelling that we'll be under. That's what all that represents. When that day comes, I will raise up the fallen sukkah of David. I will close up its gaps. In other words, there'll be nothing of it that will be wrong. Raise up its ruins and rebuild it as it used to be, so that Israel can possess what is left of Edom. Edom is today's modern Arabs. And all of the nations bearing my name, says Adonai, who is doing this. Start at the top again. When that day comes, I will raise up the fallen sukkah of David. I will close up its gaps. I will raise up its ruins and rebuild it as it used to be, so that Israel can possess what is left of Edom and all of the nations bearing my name, says Adonai, who is doing this. Verse 13. The day will come, says Adonai, when the plowman will overtake the reaper, and the one treading grapes the one sowing seeds. Sweet wine will drip down from the mountains, and all the hills will flow with it. I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel. They will rebuild and inhabit the ruined cities. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine, cultivate gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant them on their own soil, no more to be uprooted from their land which I gave them, says Adonai your God. That is the era that's coming. That's what's been introduced to us in Zechariah chapter 9. And we'll close with that for tonight.